It's September 2012. We're in Lima, the capital of Peru. A spokesperson from one of the country's biggest TV stations is giving an interview. She says, the program is not to blame. Do not blame us for the death of Ruth Thalía. She's the production manager on a brand new quiz TV show. Its first episode aired 2 months ago, and it hasn't left the headlines since. The name of the show is El Valor de la Verdad, or The Value of the Truth. But its first episode will be a disaster. And its first ever contestant, a young woman called Ruth Thalía, will soon disappear after revealing intimate details about her life in front of her closest loved ones. What Ruth Thalía will say that night shocks the nation. She becomes an overnight sensation and walks away with a prize jackpot. But just a few months later, her body will be found at the bottom of a well. So what role did Peruvian TV play in Ruth Thalía's death? And what does her story tell us about the rising rates of femicides in Peru? This is True Crime Reports, a global crime show from Al Jazeera. Today's episode, The Value of the Truth. Let's go back a little bit, around 2 decades. We're in the capital city of Peru. Lima is a huge metropolis perched on the coast, looking out over the South Pacific Ocean. At the time, Lima's population of 9 million are mainly of European descent, but there are many minority indigenous communities too. This is Neil Giardino. Neil is a journalist who covers politics and gender violence in Peru.
It's a city of stark contrasts. Most of the coastal, sort of the elite of Lima live along the coast, and there are many very large hillside slums.
Our story starts in an area on the outskirts of the city called Huachipa.
Huachipa is part of the immense and sprawling district of Lurigancho, and this is an enormous district of Peru. Largely, these are very low-income neighborhoods in Lurigancho, Huachipa, and so it's certainly a rough and tumble part of the capital.
In Huachipa, economic and educational opportunities are minimal. Young men earn their money by driving moto taxis. These are 3-wheeled motorbikes with roofs. They work long days for minimal rewards. This is the area where the main person in our story, Ruth Thalía Sanchez, grows up. She has a sister, Eva, and her parents are Leoncio and Vilma. They used to live in the mountains, but like many indigenous families, moved to the city to find work. Life here can be tough. Ruth Thalía and her sister are bullied at school for only being able to speak the indigenous Inca tongue, Quechua. And for the first few years, the family struggles to earn. They survive by selling watermelon and pineapple. The family feels a sense of hope, though. Leoncio and Vilma play traditional Peruvian music in a pop band. She sings, he plays harp, and they dream of a better life for their daughters. As the 90s become the noughties, Ruth Thalía and her sister Eva grow up. Ruth Thalía enrolls at university to study accounting. Meanwhile, plans are afoot for a new TV show.
El Valor de la Verdad was a Peruvian reality TV show. It translates to the value of the truth. And this was a show that sort of prompted contestants in 21 questions to reveal their deepest, darkest secrets in exchange for cash prizes.
By 2012, this show, El Valor de la Verdad, is already topping viewing figures in over 40 other countries. And powered by its success, it's coming to Peru. The show is unlike anything Peruvian audiences have ever seen before. Here's how it works. Contestants are hooked up to a polygraph, a sort of lie detector that measures things like heart rate and blood pressure. In front of a live audience, which includes their closest loved ones, they're asked a string of questions that gradually become more intimate in nature. If they answer all the questions truthfully, they walk away with the jackpot. If at any point they lie, they walk away with nothing. They've got everything to win and everything to lose. It's designed for addictive viewing, and it's designed to shock.
Reality TV in Peru certainly does not reflect the toils, preoccupations, and struggles of ordinary Peruvians in the country's Andes and Amazon. It's vastly out of touch with the day-to-day reality and the insecurities of everyday Peruvian life. It's often incredibly sensationalized and reflective of a very small minority of wealthy white Peruvians.
Now, Ruth Thalía is 19 at this point. She has shoulder-length brown hair, and when she's not at university, she works in a call centre. She has dreams of opening a spa and one day being famous. She's been saving up and has applied for a few soap operas and game shows in the hope they might make her rich. So when news of a new groundbreaking game show starts to spread, she listens up. The jackpot is worth 50,000 sols, or around $15,000. That's nearly 4 years' wages. Ruth Thalía goes for it. As the gentle warmth of the Peruvian summer arrives, she travels to the TV studios in Lima. The channel is called Frecuencia Latina, a major Peruvian TV channel. It's an ugly building that looks a bit like a military bunker, out of place in the middle of a residential neighbourhood. Ruth Thalía arrives, records her episodes, the camera switches off, and she goes home. It won't be aired for another few weeks, but her fate has been sealed. It's now July 2012. Several weeks have passed. Peru's been gripped by political tensions for weeks as locals protest against government plans for a new gold mine that they fear will contaminate water supplies. Peruvians are looking for some escapism and settle down to watch the first ever episode of a brand new quiz show everyone's been talking about. El Valor de la Verdad, hosted by the country's most powerful journalist and politically incorrect talk show host, Beto Ortiz. He's sharp, inquisitive, funny, and has millions of fans. He's a highly controversial figure with a very successful career. His outspoken manner has got him mixed up in defamation cases, and Peru's most influential newspaper has described him as a monster. Beto begins the show with the line,
Si dicen la verdad hasta el final, podrían ganar 50,000 soles.
Ruth Thalía steps onto the stage. Her straight, brown hair sits just above her shoulders, and she's wearing a floaty cream top with stripes.
¿Estás nerviosa, Ruth Thalía?
Sí, un poco, pero normal.
She settles herself in the chair, centre stage, looking at Beto. He asks if she's ready to tell the truth in front of her whole family, to herself, and to all of Peru. She says she is. Just off stage under the harsh studio lights sit Ruth Talia's parents and her boyfriend. Ruth Talia's mum is excited. She thinks her daughter is going to talk about her upbringing, the province she's from, and be a proud voice for indigenous Peruvians. Sat next to her, her husband is less sure. He'd asked his daughter not to appear on the show. Now, on set, his anxiety is palpable. Finally, perched at the end of the sofa is the boyfriend, Brian Romero Lavia. He's good-looking, 20 years old, but a serious kid, not very talkative. He's from the same neighbourhood as Ruth Thalía and works as a moto taxi driver. Ruth Talia's mum will later tell a reporter, "I don't know why, but I hated that kid." The lights dim and the questions begin.
¿Alguna vez dejaste de asistir a tus clases sin que tu madre lo sepa?
They start simple. funny even. That's the structure of the show. Beto asks Ruth Thalia if she'd ever skipped classes without telling her mum, if she'd ever gone without showering for a while, if she thinks being pretty gets you further than being good.
Sí.
Yeses to all. Then the questions get a little deeper. He asks if she thinks Brian, her boyfriend, is handsome. She hesitates, then says yes. That didn't sound very convincing, says Beto. He asks if Brian's smart. Kind of, she replies. The audience laughs. We're at question 12 out of 21. Beto asks if Ruth Thalia is only with Brian until someone better comes along. She says yes. Brian looks stunned. Beto chides her for giving such a cruel answer. At one point, Brian says, "I don't want to hear any more."
¿No quieres escuchar más?
No.
He looks distressed, but Beto presses on. The jackpot is growing with each answer she gives. He asks if she really works in a call centre. She says no. Does she work in a nightclub? Yes. She explains that nightclubs can mean very different things. Beto asks her how much clothing she wears while she's dancing. Very little, she replies. He asks if she has sexual fantasies about women. She says yes. We're at question 18. This will be the one on which Ruth Thalia's future will hang.
Pregunta 18. ¿Alguna vez has aceptado dinero a cambio de tener relaciones sexuales?
Beto asks if she's ever accepted money for sex. There's a long pause. If she answers truthfully, she'll have 15,000 sols in the bank. That's 10 months' wages. The pause stretches. It's painful, awkward. Finally, Ruth Thalia speaks. Yes, she says.
2 veces, solo 2 veces. Y de ahí no ha vuelto a pasar ni volverá a pasar. Creo que fue por cuestiones económicas, o sea, que estábamos en una situación económica muy crítica.
Beto asks her if she wants to stop there or try for the jackpot. Ruth thinks for a while before replying.
Me retiro.
As the credits roll, Ruth Thalia stands up, walks to the sofa where her parents and boyfriend sit, and drops to her knees before her ashen-faced mother. The host Beto turns to the camera and says, "The truth is always illuminating. It will not do harm, even though it hurts." The show becomes an overnight sensation. It's a complete and total success, knocking the #1 show from the top spot. And Ruth Thalia's face is everywhere. She's all over the news, photographed next to a manager from the TV channel, holding a check for 15,000 sols, grinning. But that's where her good fortune ends. She and Brian break up, and very soon the tide of public shock and anger turns against her. The Sanchez family phone is ringing off the hook. Members of Ruth's family are calling to say how ashamed they are. The fact she'd lied about her workplace, that she'd accepted money for sex, that she'd had sexual fantasies about women, and the humiliation she'd put Brian through. It's all too much for a country where, around this time, 65% of the population oppose gay marriage, and prejudice towards indigenous communities is stark.
Ruth Talia's revelations would be incredibly shocking to ordinary Peruvians. This is a very conservative Catholic nation that looks down on certain sexual taboos, including homosexuality.
The media piles in on Ruth Thalia.
Television news in Peru is often highly sensationalized, often toes a certain state narrative in a country that's deeply divided. Peruvians are not looking to television news to inform themselves. It's much more geared towards sensationalism and entertainment.
News outlets hound Brian, who tells them he can never forgive her for what she's put him through. He visits the TV station, asking for compensation for his humiliation. When that fails, he turns up at his ex-girlfriend's home, demanding a cut of the prize money. Ruth Thalia retreats within herself. She tells her mum she's thinking of taking her own life. The summer passes. It's September, 2 months since the episode aired. It's a Tuesday evening, and Ruth Thalia is leaving her accounting classes. She gets on the bus to her neighbourhood of Huachipa. The next morning, Vilma shakes her husband awake in desperation. Thalia has not come home, she says. Let's step back from Ruth Thalia's story for a moment, as it's important to give some cultural context. This is 2012 Peru. Racial and ethnic divides at the time are stark. There's a long-standing history of persecution of indigenous Peruvians, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and forced sterilizations. Violence against women is widespread too.
This is a country of 33 million in which 1 in 3 women experience some form of physical or sexual violence. In 2016, Peru's human rights ombudsman reports that on average 10 women were murdered by their partners every month. Another study showed that between 2009 and 2015, in 81% of cases of attempted femicide, no measures were taken by authorities to protect the victims. 24% of those women were then subsequently murdered by their partners.
This is the context in which our story unfolds. It's been 4 days since Ruth Thalia was last seen. Her parents are in panic mode. They filed a missing persons report, but aren't getting much movement from the police. And so, desperate, Leoncio and Vilma turn to the media, hoping they'll help. There's a TV station called ATV. It's one of the country's most watched channels. And when they hear the missing girl is the same one who recently appeared on the first episode of a very popular new TV show, they agree to help. 4 days after her disappearance, ATV runs the story on their evening news programme. The newsreader calls Ruth Thalia the prostitute from El Valor de la Verdad. Vilma will later say, "They killed me in my heart." The media intrusion ramps up. Leoncio and Vilma are followed everywhere by camera crews as they search desperately for help. Ruth Thalia's nowhere to be found, and it's all anyone can talk about. ATV interviews Brian, her boyfriend. What were his movements that night? "I don't remember," he says. "I was drunk." Where is Ruth Thalia? It's a Saturday afternoon, 11 days since Ruth Thalia disappeared. Leoncio's phone rings. It's the TV station, ATV. They've got news. If you drive about 3 hours northeast, out of Lima, into the Andes Mountains, eventually you reach a tiny mountain hamlet on a dusty road. In this hamlet, on a small plot of land, there's a well. And at the bottom of that well, the voice at the end of the phone tells Leoncio, covered by rocks and concrete, a body's been found. This plot of land is owned by a man called Reddy Lever. Reddy Lever is Brian's uncle. Immediately, things start to happen. Back in Lima, a figure appears at the missing persons office on España Street. It's a young man. He wants to confess. It's Brian. "It was an accident," he says. "They'd argued, and it just happened." Brian takes a group of officers to the place where he'd buried her. He takes them to the mountain hamlet and points at the well. Leoncio's there too. On recognising his daughter, he throws a rock at Brian's head. It's a few days later. Brian's in the confession room, reconstructing the events of the 11th of September 2012 for the police. He claims he met Ruth Thalia when she was done with university that day. He picked her up in his moto taxi and they drove back to his mother's house. They drank some cheap wine and had sex. Then they started to fight, he says. She tells me, "I don't know what I'm doing talking to a poor moto taxi driver. And that's when I grabbed her by the throat." She passed out, he says. "I listened to her heart. I didn't hear anything. I grabbed her and shook her hard. I got scared." He waits for several hours, but Ruth Thalia doesn't move. With the help of his uncle, he tells police he takes a motorcycle taxi and drives the body 3 hours into the mountains. But it was an accident, Brian says. He didn't mean to. It was a crime of passion. The death of Ruth Thalia is the top story on every channel, except for Frecuencia Latina, the network where this story began. Incredibly, it's business as usual there, and they run with their regular Saturday programming, El Valor de la Verdad. A few days later, a production manager for the channel makes the announcement. "Of course, we're going to continue with the program, because the program is not to blame," she says. "Do not blame us for the death of Ruth Thalia." Time passes. Leoncio, Vilma, and their daughter Eva grieve while Brian and the uncle await trial. We're now in early 2014, a year and a half later. Season 3 of El Valor de la Verdad has just begun, and the long-forgotten media storm surrounding Ruth Thalia's death is about to be reignited. On the outskirts of Lima stands a large, grey, imposing building. It's called Lurigancho, and it's Peru's largest prison. It's been called corrupt, overcrowded, and violent, a high school for criminality. And it's here that the trial for the murder of Ruth Thalia is due to begin. Leoncio, Vilma, and their daughter Eva have long suspected Brian had sinister motives in killing his ex-girlfriend. This was premeditated, they think, but Brian's lawyers are saying differently. Brian made a mistake. The uncle was an innocent bystander, and this was a crime of passion, they insist.
So it was important for Ruth Thalia's killer to insist that this was a crime of passion rather than a premeditated killing, in that it would sort of dictate and guide sentencing protocols.
This difference is key. Premeditated murder or accident. If Brian can convince the courts it was a crime of passion, that holds a far lesser sentence for both him and the uncle. The sentence for premeditated murder is life. But it's Brian and the uncle's word against no one's. The only person in the world who would have been able to say otherwise is Ruth Thalia. And then something happens which will change the course of the trial and determine Brian's fate. A young teenage boy, a 14-year-old from the neighbourhood, has come forward with a curious tale. He's saying he knows what really happened the night Ruth Thalia died because he was there. According to the boy, it goes like this. Brian had approached the boy and asked him to ring him when Ruth Thalia got off the bus. In exchange for his help, Brian would give him 50 sols, around $20, and a mobile phone. This is what happened next, according to the boy. Later that evening, he alerted Brian when the bus carrying Ruth Thalia pulled into the neighbourhood. He watched as Brian, helped by his uncle, forced her into his moto taxi. Hours later, the boy says he saw the two men carrying Ruth Thalia's body from Brian's mother's house. This is the missing piece of the puzzle that Ruth Thalia's family has been looking for. On the 27th of February 2014, almost 2 years after she appeared on the show, a verdict is finally reached. Brian Romero is convicted of the premeditated murder of Ruth Thalia, aided by his uncle. They're both sentenced to life in prison, and ordered to pay civil reparations of 700,000 Peruvian sols, that's around $250,000, to her family. The court concludes that Ruth Thalia had been poisoned and strangled. The type of poison used is unclear. Some reports say Brian had drugged her with a sleeping tablet, but this wasn't ever proven. The motive? Financial. The court surmised they'd attempted to get Ruth Thalia's bank security code in the hope they could take her winnings. Vilma, Leoncio and Eva attend the hearing and afterwards give a statement to the media. They say justice has been served, but Vilma, Ruth Thalia's mum, says that nobody can understand her pain. It's too immense, she says. So what happens next? After that initial disastrous episode, El Valor de la Verdad is recommissioned, not once, not twice, but for 5 whole seasons. But what role did they play in the death of Ruth Thalia?
I think that media, news coverage, and reality TV shows, and in particular this case, there's almost a complicity in the murder of Ruth Thalia. These programs are sort of laced with misogyny and to sort of demonstrate this machismo culture that is so pervasive in Peruvian society.
This question of the show's culpability hung over the case for years. The host, Beto Ortiz, had been called to testify at the trial in those early months of 2014. He acknowledged that what had happened was terrible, but refused to accept that the show had anything to do with the murder. We approached Beto for comment, but he didn't reply. We also approached the TV station for comment on their role in Ruth Thalia's death. They didn't reply.
It's my opinion that the situation following Ruth Thalia's death has gotten worse in Peru. You know, cases of femicide have been soaring, as well as cases of disappearance among women. And really, it's a system that continues to fail women at every step.
Neil says there were 3 cases in 2023 that really shone a harsh light on gender violence in Peru.
So, most notably, there was an 18-year-old woman named Catherine Gomez who was doused in gasoline and burned alive in a city park in central Lima, in historic Lima, by her ex-boyfriend. Within weeks of that case, there was the absolutely brutal rape and murder of a 32-year-old mother and nurse in the Andean region of Puno by 2 of her coworkers. And finally, there was another story, all within the same time frame, the attempted rape and absolute awful violence committed against an 11-year-old girl in the Amazon region of the country in Ucayali. And so we are constantly being inundated with stories, horrific stories of gender violence in Peru, and it only seems to be escalating.
Years later, a local journalist visited Huachipa to see how Leoncio, Vilma and Eva were getting on. He found them in pain, struggling. Recent storms and floods had destroyed many of their belongings, and the years had been tough, particularly for Vilma. For a long time after her daughter's death, she'd stopped singing. She told that journalist, "I'm with Thalia day and night. Her picture is here. I tell her about everything. When I get up, good morning, dear. When I go out, take care of your siblings. That's when I realize I'm not accepting her death. I tell her sometimes, why don't you speak? You have to speak." But she's in a photograph and doesn't answer. This was True Crime Reports, a global crime series from Al Jazeera. In our next episode, we're in 1970s Cambodia, hearing the strange tale of Malcolm Caldwell, a Scottish professor who shot dead just hours after meeting the infamous dictator Pol Pot. Thank you for joining. See you next week.